It's time for us to get started. If you'd like to find a seat, we will get started this morning. And if you'd like to open to Philippians chapter 2, we're gonna finish Philippians chapter 2 this week. So if you open up there to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 25 is where we're going to get started. Oh, we'll wait for you, Mr. Fudge. We'll wait for you. All right. We're in Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 25, if you'd like to open up there. And we've been looking for a little while now at the book of Philippians and considering that primarily it's a book about conflict, and especially conflict within the church. And so, as with any family, if you spend enough time together, eventually there'll be something that causes conflict. And so the book of Philippians was written in part to give us sort of a mindset, what he calls a mature mindset that ultimately is kind of the key to joy, especially in times of conflict, of how do we deal with conflict. And in Philippians chapter 2 and verses 1 through 4, he gave us really our first set of instructions as far as the mindset that we are to have. That's very focused on thinking the same and loving each other. And then he gives us 4 examples of people who put these things into practice so that we could understand his instructions. Sometimes you need a good illustration or example, something you can picture in your mind to really understand it. And so he gave us that, verses 5 through 11 through Christ, verses 12 through 18 through himself, verses 19 to 24 through Timothy. And so today we're going to start on that 4th example of Epaphroditus in Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 25. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 25, he says, "Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, but your messenger and the one who ministered to my need, since he was longing for you all, and he was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me." Sarah, can I ask you to take care of that? I forgot about it. Thank you so much. So he's kind of set up this idea here of what do I value, or in particular, whom do I value? If we're kind of building this mature mindset, he talks about Epaphroditus' sacrifice and the idea of do I value most those who value or those whom Christ values? Excuse me. Am I valuing most those whom Christ is valuing? And he gives us some principles here to consider as we go through here. Starting in verse 25, that we're valuing those who share deeply in the gospel work. Notice what he says here in verse 25. He says, "Yet I considered it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, my fellow worker, and my fellow soldier, but he's your messenger and the one who ministered to my needs." Now, let's just kind of remember for a moment, what situation does Paul find himself in here in the book of Philippians? Yes, he's in Rome. Right? In Romans, he hadn't been there yet. Now, apparently, he's gone, and he's in house arrest in Rome because of the complications he had in preaching the gospel in Jerusalem. He's taken to Rome and put on house arrest. And so he says that there's this man, Epaphroditus, whom they have the church in Philippi has sent to Rome to help take care of Paul. Remember, if you were on house arrest in Rome, it wasn't like our prisons today where they take care of your food and your pillows and your blankets and whatever you need. You didn't have anything if you didn't have friends to bring it to you. And so he can't leave the home that he's supposed to stay in. So if he runs out of food, that's it. He's just out of food. And so the churches were sending people to kind of help him out. And so this church sent Epaphroditus to come, he says, minister or take care of, to serve my needs. And he says there that he considered it necessary to send Epaphroditus back to them. And so Paul is sharing Epaphroditus after they had shared back to them after they had shared Epaphroditus with him. There's kind of this back and forth thing going on here. And notice how it describes three different kinds of fellowship here. He says there's my brother, there's my fellow worker, and then there's the fellow soldier. And so in listing all three of those, he's really emphasizing three different things. What perhaps kinds of things are emphasized by each of these? What would be emphasizing when he says brother, as far as their fellowship goes? Yeah, it's the family idea. Yeah, it's specifically not a physical family, but spiritual family, the brother in Christ. But he's emphasizing that family relationship that they all share. What perhaps would be emphasized when he says a fellow worker? It could be teachers, or it really just any kind of work that the church would be doing together. The word for work is the idea of to toil, to labor until you're really, really tired. And so, that's sometimes how we feel at the end of Christmas Day, is just really, really tired. That's the idea here of toiling. They are a family, and they do the same things together. They work together. And then finally, this one is really, I think, key to the section. What is emphasized when he calls him a fellow soldier? That's okay, Miss Faye.
Well, I was just thinking that fellow soldiers would be those who are working despite the forces against them.
Yes, I think that's exactly it. It's really emphasizing the idea of the risk that's being taken, that there's a cause, a bigger purpose that they're working for, and the soldier emphasizes the risk taken to work for the cause. And so, but it's all done together. There's a fellowship, our fellow brother, our fellow soldier, that's emphasized. The word for fellow is actually kind of an interesting word. Does anyone know the English word synergy? I don't like that word. It's one of those less than concrete words. But people use synergy. It's the idea of things that work together. They kind of weave together to accomplish something. And so I think business-minded people use it the most. And the idea of we're going to have synergy. We're going to weave something together. And so we have this person and that person and that person and that person, and they all weave it together to make something happen. And that comes from this Greek word, which sounds almost just like synergy. That's where we get our word from. And it does kind of give you this mental picture of he's talking about weaving things together, that in fellow, it's more than just, how toddlers kind of co-play. And like little kids, they don't play together, they play next to each other. And I have my blocks and you have your blocks, and we're in the same room and we feel connected. And then as they get older, they begin to play together, they imagine things and talk to one another more. It's more the idea of they're not just doing things that are of the same purpose, but that they're working together, and that each part has its role, and when they all do their role, it kind of weaves together into something beautiful that produces something of great value. But the emphasis, as he says, we're fellows, fellow brothers, fellow workers, fellow soldiers, is that this emphasis on sharing in the work of the church, sharing in the work of the gospel, that the goal they're producing is belief in the gospel and taking care of one another so that we can do the work of the gospel. And that's why he follows and says that while they sent him Epaphroditus, and so they helped him, now he's going to send him back to them. And then he says that he's your messenger. That's just, they sent Paul a message, a message to Paul from them, and the one who helped me, the one who ministered to my need. And so they helped him, but the work of the gospel must go on. And so he's sending them back to help them. And this is what he's valuing here. Now, as he continues in verse 26, he says, since he was longing for you all, and he was distressed because you heard that he was sick. And so what is it that's really valued here? It's those who are craving deeply to comfort God's people in times of need. Someone who really is concerned about God's people, someone who really, their heart is touched when someone goes through something. It's kind of the idea of Romans chapter 12, and I think verse 17, when he says, rejoice with those who rejoice, but also weep with those who weep, that when something happens to one of us, we all feel that deeply because, as we talked about back in the first 4 verses of Philippians 2, we think of ourselves as one. We think of ourselves as deeply united. What happens to you is as if it's happening to me. And that's how Epaphroditus felt. Apparently, he'd gone to Rome, and he was helping Paul out, but he fell ill. And this actually was really common. If you traveled during certain times of the year, especially closer to wintertime, as you traveled across the ocean as trying to beat the ice, they got to a point where they couldn't travel by boat during parts of the year. You were more susceptible during that time of year to catch diseases on the boat. And so he likely got to Rome and began to help and then fell ill. And we'll notice in a minute, it wasn't just your run-of-the-mill kind of cold. It was a very grave and serious kind of illness that he was facing here. And so while he was the one that was sick, it says he was distressed about you. Now, distressed is kind of the idea of to feel great, intense pressure. And so it says he felt very deeply for you because you heard he was sick, right? Have you ever not told your mother you were sick because you didn't want her to worry, that kind of thing? Right? They found out he was sick, and he felt concerned about their worry. Even though he was the one that was sick, he was worried about them. And he says that he was longing for you. Longing is the idea of to intensely crave something, right? Everyone has their Christmas treat that they always hope is in their stocking, and you just wait for it all year long. For me, it's orange slices. Santa almost always brings me not orange slices, sorry, chocolate oranges. Do you know those? Right? Nobody wants oranges in their stocking. Chocolate oranges, right? You know what I'm talking about? And they break apart, and they chocolate that tastes like orange. Santa almost always brings me that in my stocking, and that's only the time of year I get it, and all year I crave those chocolate oranges, and it's that kind of craving that he is craving deeply to comfort them because he heard that they were worried about him when he was sick. And when he says sickness, it's literally the idea of he's lost all of his virility. He's so sick that his body is given in. It's very weak. It's the kind of thing where someone gets so sick that afterwards they don't look like themselves because they've lost so much weight, and they can barely stand. That it's a physically altering kind of sickness that when he went back to them, maybe they wouldn't even recognize him at first. And so he's very ill, but even while he's ill, he's very worried about them. And so he was sent to comfort Paul, and now he's being sent back to comfort the Philippians. And you notice there's this sense of mutualness, that the Philippians are concerned about Paul, and Paul is concerned about the Philippians, and there's just this they're always thinking about one another. Now, what does that remind us of? Just one moment, Miss Faye. What does that remind us of from the beginning of the chapter? Paul's always thinking about them, and they're always thinking about Paul. Well, what does that remind us of from early on in the chapter that we've kind of come back to over and over again? You think he gives us some instructions very early on.
Well, to take care of one another for one thing.
Yeah, it's...
And that's what I was thinking.
Okay.
A family like it's supposed to be, they care for one another, they
Yes.
look out for one another,
Yes.
they reach out if someone's sick,
Mhm.
whether it be your family at home or your husband.
That's right. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, the family at home is sort of a picture of what the church family is to be. That when someone is sick, you're reaching out to, you send a care package with tissues and blankets and whatnot, and that they are grateful for that and appreciative to you. And so it's back to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 4 when he says, "Let each of you look out not only for your own interest," and that's what we looked at last time with Timothy. He says, that there is a degree of, if I'm not taking care of myself, I can't help you. I reach a limit, a breaking point, and I can't keep going, and so I drop the balls that I said I would carry. That idea of, when the mask drops in the airplane, you have to put the mask on you first, or else you'll pass out when you're trying to put it on your kids, and you'll both not have air. And so it with verses 19 through 24, he does talk about that, but the purpose of all of that is not selfishness, it's so that I can take care of you. Epaphroditus had to get better first before he could travel, but now that he's improved, his main concern is to go back and to take care of them. Philippians 2:4, "Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also the interest of others." Now continuing then into verse 27, it says, "For indeed he was sick almost unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. Now, it says, first of all, I want to point out when he says that it was sick almost unto death, what it literally says there is that death became his neighbor. That's kind of the picture that's drawn in the word. Those old words, those ancient words, they're really more picture words. And so the picture that they would have seen was that death was just sitting right next to him. It's, if you could, those movies where the Grim Reaper comes in and he's got his big sickle in his hood and he sits down next to you and you talk to him. That's really kind of the picture that he's drawing here. This is how close he was to death. It was just right there. And it was only by the mercy of God that he wasn't taken by death. And so you see the severity of his illness, but even in the severity of that illness, what he wants is to comfort the people who care about him. And so he's concerned about himself, certainly, and getting the help that he needs. But that is in large part so that he can go back and comfort the people that are concerned about him. Now, when you think about what he says here, he was sick, and God had mercy on him, not just him, but also me, lest I should have sorrow. And Paul says, I would have been very sad if Epaphroditus had died. I would have felt very upset about that. What might seem unusual about Paul's reaction to this, especially when you think about what he said already about death in Philippians? I think there's an important thing to notice there in kind of drawing a contrast. You think back to Philippians chapter 1, and Paul talks about death there, and he has a particular mindset about his own death. When he says in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 21, for me, to live is Christ, but to die is gain. And so when Paul is thinking about his own death, he says, of course I want to be here, and that's what he goes on to say is, I'm happy to remain, he says in verse 24, because it's more needful for you. The reason why Paul is glad to still be alive is so that he can look out for the interest of others, and that's the primary purpose. But he says, if I had my brothers, I'd be happy to go on to the next life, where I can be closer to Christ. My purpose for living is Christ, but I'll be closer to him there. And especially given his circumstances, he'd be fine with moving. In fact, it'd be gain, he says. And so here he says it's a benefit to go on to the next life. And then the next chapter, he says he would be sad for Epaphroditus to go on to the next life. And I think, of course, Paul is always consistent in what he says. This is not a contradiction. The point to bring it up is it tells us something about grieving. What perhaps would this tell us about grieving for each other at death?
We may long for heaven, but we still love the people that are here, and we don't want to die and leave them. We don't want them to die and leave us.
That's right, yes.
Even though we know that there's a better place for all of us.
For all of us, yes, ma'am.
I mean, I don't think, see how you can just say, I love my family, and then not grieve when they're gone.
That's right, yes.
Even though they're in a better place.
I think that's exactly it. Sometimes at funerals, or just associated with funerals, I hear people talk about grief as if it's inappropriate. Well, that person has gone on to a better place, and we should just be happy for them. But Paul says he would have grieved. And he doesn't say it with apology. The Holy Spirit has inspired him to say, it's okay to grieve. That while we are happy for them, to die is gain for those who are in Christ, while we are happy for them, it doesn't mean that separation from them doesn't hurt and that we don't miss them. And that while we can feel happy for them, we can simultaneously feel grief. And I think that's important because sometimes we delay and prolong the difficulties of the grieving process because we can't just admit to ourselves that we're sad, because we're trying to just, and that's such a difficult distinction, I think, when he says to look out not only for your own interest, but also the interest of others. Sometimes we interpret that to mean, I'm not concerned about me at all, I only think about others, and therefore, however I feel or whatever I do is unimportant to me. But that's not, and that's, I think, why the examples are so useful. As he's talked about himself and others, Paul says, I do want to go on to the next life. That would be a great benefit, and I want that for Epaphroditus when it's the right time. But if he did leave, I would feel sad. And in looking out for himself, he has to acknowledge that grief and deal with that grief, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And that really sets him up, that honesty with himself, to be better prepared to help other people because he's not holding on to baggage that he's ignoring and not dealing with. Mr. Phillip, yes.
The shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I see discussions on a certain website that I participate in about crime and the appropriateness of it and so forth, and I have more than once mentioned to someone who was asking a question about that, the shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept.
Yes.
And therefore, there is nothing wrong with people doing it. And as long as you know this is not just something all the time, and you fall to pieces at the slightest thing.
Yeah.
One thing I think it's been said that our grief when somebody dies is not for them, it's for us.
In a way, I think that's true. Yes.
And I really think that is often true, especially if we know the person was a faithful Christian, and we expect them to be in heaven.
Yes,
But
sir.
I think we need to make some allowances for different levels of grief.
Sure.
Look, if you got a 14-year-old kid,
It's just
I can
different.
relate to this.
Yeah.
Because he had a sister about that age and his mother who were both killed in a car wreck
Yes, sir.
when he was, 8 years old, John? 9.
9 years old, yeah.
If you have somebody who suffers the loss of a young person under totally unexpected circumstances, you are liable to grieve somewhat more than if it's a 90-something-year-old relative who's been sick for years and has suffered a long time.
Sure, yeah.
And I think we need to cut people some slack and realize there could be varying levels of grief.
Yes, and I think that's true. He mentions Jesus wept, and that happens in the book of John after his friend Lazarus dies. And it's a very interesting account, isn't it? Because don't you think Jesus knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead in just a few minutes? But it says that he saw the grief of the sisters and he wept because he identified and empathized with what they were feeling. He felt that sadness over the separation. It didn't matter that Lazarus was going to come back in a few minutes. In this moment and in this reality, he was gone. And it was okay for Jesus to weep and to grieve. Now, if it's okay for Jesus to weep and grieve knowing Lazarus is coming back, it's certainly okay for us to. And I think Philip has a good point in saying that grief is just going to look different for each person. And it may even look different on each person in different circumstances based on who died and how it happened and those things. And that certainly we can have a lot of patience and grace with one another during that grieving process. Miss Faith?
Well, but this is something that's so near and dear to my heart.
Yes, ma'am, I know.
But when we do go to see someone who's lost a loved one, I don't care what age they are,
Sure.
they're going to grieve.
Yeah.
And we do need to be careful about, it's almost like you're laying guilt on them if they grieve, if you say they're in a better place. You should be happy. Well, you can't really be happy and grieve at the same time. You gotta work it through.
You have to work it through, yes.
And we need to give them.
I think that's true. That's there is that happiness that you might know you feel about their better place or what have you. That doesn't take away how you feel, and you have to make room for that also. And that that really the best advice I think I've ever heard about visiting someone who's grieving is sometimes the best thing is just to be there and say nothing. And that there's a certain value in being comfortable with someone's grieving and not feeling the need to try to fix it for them, but just to be there present for it. That there's a great value in that, and that our culture really feels the need to fix other people's emotions, but that's not what they did in the Bible, and that's not what we should do either.
It says weep with those
I was
who weep.
thinking though, more along the line with this Philippians 1, we need to be more concerned about preparing ourselves for that time.
Sure.
And we have so many people today that want to live to be 100 years old. That's all they concentrate on. I gotta live to be 100.
Yeah.
Well, now they want to go 120 or maybe even forever.
Right.
But
Some people are really trying forever. Yes.
we don't need to be concerned ourselves about how long we're going to live. We need to be more concerned about whether we're prepared
Yeah.
to go when it's our time.
No matter how old we are, we're never guaranteed tomorrow or even the rest of today, and so it's more important. And that's Paul says to die is gain, but only because he's ready for it. Yeah, that's right. Johnny, did you have something?
When Christ was in the Garden of Gethsemane, it describes the scripture decides the state he was in. I think a lot of that was grief also.
Oh, yes.
Because he knew he was just to be separated. And I've heard lots of different sermons on
Right, yeah.
was he separated from God himself when he died. I'm not sure about that.
We can get into that another day, yeah. But
But he knew that those who were gonna be around him was gonna grieve
yeah,
tremendously, because their idea, they, was, at the time, most of them thought he was gonna be.
they didn't even understand what he was
They
doing.
wouldn't understand, but the
Right.
grief that they were fixing to go through was gonna be tremendous.
He took no pleasure in their grief. That's right, yeah. And God takes no pleasure when we grieve. In fact, it says that when one of his when one of his die, he takes no pleasure in the fact that death is necessary and the grief that follows for those who are still here. God is concerned about that greatly. Philip.
Well, in going to people who are grieving, the Bible tells us to weep with those who weep.
Yes, sir.
And so that's, you might have to make some effort to do that. Because if it's a loved one of theirs that you don't even know, you know, we might have to.
Yeah, well, I think that's really what Paul is getting at here is that's right, yeah, that what we're working toward, you go back to Philippians chapter 2 and verse 2 when he says, fulfill my joy by being thinking the same, like-minded, having the same love, and being of one accord, of one mind, that if we are thinking the same, and if my soul is how does it put it with Jonathan and David?
Knit together.
I'm sorry.
Knit together.
Knit together with yours, so that it's as if we are one person in that sense. Then if we're building toward that, then we will reach a place where, though I may not know Philip's second cousin, whom he was close to, but I never met, just because Philip hurts, it does hurt me. Because I think you're right. I think sometimes it's difficult to feel deeply for the death of someone we don't know. And it's less about, here in this idea, it's less about who died and more about who's hurting. And that's really the emphasis. I think that's a good point, Philip. It's a good Philip point. No, but as we continue then, he says in verse 28, he says, therefore I sent him the more eagerly, that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less sorrowful. And so I think here there is kind of this idea of that we're looking, the value is with those who look deeply into what Paul will later call worthy thoughts. Do you remember from Philippians chapter 4 and starting in verse 8, he says whatever things are true or noble or just and so forth and so on, that we're to set our minds on these things. And that's there's sort of this emphasis here that we are looking closely at those things so that in these difficult times we can find joy and less sorrow. And I say that in part because of the word that he uses. He says that when you see him, and that word for see is, the Bible really uses a lot of different words for English S-E-E, to see something. And for example, in Acts chapter 1, when it's describing Jesus going up into heaven, it says repeatedly that the disciples watched him go. But it's actually about 5 different Greek words that are used there that all emphasize just how intently he watched them. Not just that they saw it sort of vaguely, but that they remember it with such great detail because of how close they were looking. And this is one of those words, and the distinction of this word is the idea of to look at something with a purpose. It's not sort of a glance. It's to set your eyes on it with an intense sort of stare so that you can determine something about it, so you can fully understand it. It's to look at someone's face close enough to recognize what emotions are being displayed, what tics are going off, to kind of try to put yourself into their mind and really understand more than just see with your eyes. And so he says he's going to come back and they're going to look closely at him. And they are going to find that even if he looks thin and frail and hungry and like he's just been through it, they're going to find great reasons to rejoice because they have set their minds on the right kinds of things, to see that spiritually Epaphroditus is better off than he was before, that he has grown through this and that Paul has benefited from it, and so that they are benefiting from it as well because they've looked beyond the flesh to see the spiritual truths that are at hand. And so I think it's this perspective that can lead someone to that kind of joy, good news feeling, even in difficult times. And I think it's an important part of the grieving process. And thankfully, they didn't have to grieve to the extent that they would have if he died. But all the same, an important part of the grieving process is accepting that we grieve and to be okay with that and know there's nothing wrong with it. But then after a time, it's also to turn our perspective to see how this grieving God is using it to benefit us spiritually. And so you think Romans 8:28, it says there that there's nothing, or God can turn all things into good for those who love him. That doesn't mean that all things that happen are good, that God made everything happen, even if it's terrible. It means even when something terrible happens, God in his great providence and power can work it out for good in the end. And we can see that if we'll look. And really, this is what the Psalms do over and over again. The people in the Psalms grieve heavily and with deep emotion, but toward the end of nearly every Psalm, after grieving, they switch their perspective to see it from a spiritual side and to see what God is doing behind the scenes, and then to be able to find joy as they process their grief, because it's not just about this life, and it's not just about the temporary, but we can see greater things are happening here, and so that they can find joy in this situation. Any thoughts before we move on to verse 29, Sarah?
I think Job is a really good case study
Yes.
of what you're talking about, and it even talks about, kind of how to handle when you're with somebody who's grieving. And I think Job 2:11 to the end of the chapter is kind of a field guide of what it should look like to go comfort somebody who's grieving.
Yes.
His friends, they all make a plan, and they're going to come together, and they read the moment, and for 7 days they just sit there in grief with him. And I just imagine that was probably such a comfort to Job until they started talking.
Yes.
And that's when they messed it all up. But as long as you can just sit there in somebody's grief and be comfortable, then that's a help. At the point when you feel compelled to open your mouth, that's probably when you should take a break and not be there anymore. But
yes.
But yeah, I think because he acknowledges his grief and he's not afraid to grieve, he asks his questions and he's not afraid to ask his questions, and at the end, he and God come to this understanding, and he can move forward with his life despite all the horrible things that he's been through and still find joy.
I think so. She's referencing Job chapter 2, starting in verse 11, when Job, of course, loses so much. He loses in a day probably more than any of us have lost in a lifetime. And of course, he has a great perspective about it, but he is grieving. And you see that the friends are help to him until they begin to talk, and then that's when Job is no longer comforted by them. It's not to say that there's never anything good to say when someone's grieving, but just that it's hard. That's what James 3 says. The tongue is a hard thing to control. It's hard sometimes to say the right thing in those moments, and sometimes it's best not to say anything, because if they hadn't, Job could have worked through his grief in less time perhaps, or just in a more comfortable way to ask those questions. It was right to acknowledge that he was grieving. It was right to ask those questions. But it was right in the end to come to that right perspective that God helped him to see, and that God still helps us see through the pages of the Bible. Philip, did you have something?
Yeah, this is all reminding me of something that I read or heard years ago, that when a man is talking to a woman in his life, whether it be your girlfriend or your wife or whatever, that if the woman has a problem, the man's inclination is to fix it.
To fix it, yes.
And the woman doesn't want that. What she wants is, she wants you to listen to her.
To validate, yeah.
Now, I have found that, when I was talking to my girlfriend, that is my mindset is, let's fix it. I have to remind myself at times, that isn't what I'm supposed to do.
Yes, and when there's grief or problems in our life, sometimes it's too soon to fix it, and what we really just need is someone to listen and validate. And so that's, I think, a good point. So then, really, I think what you're getting at here is the idea, their perspective is not going to be, why did God let him get so close to death, which is sometimes, why did God let this happen? Why was he in so much pain? Their perspective is going to be, look at how his sickness revealed how much he loves us, and how much we love him, and how much Paul loves us. Look at how his sickness revealed how close we all are, how God has done something good with it. And that's the more mature mindset. It can be hard to grasp, but that we're striving to have. Finally, then, in verses 29 and 30, he says, receive him, therefore, in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such men in esteem, because for the work of Christ he came close to death, not regarding his life, to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. And so here's really where we kind of get down to the heart of this section of, who is it? Am I valuing those most whom Christ most values? Which is not to say that there's any people who are not valuable, and that we love all people, and we extend the invitation of God's grace to all people, and we desire for everyone to know God and to have this mindset. But just like Romans says, that we're to help, or I'm sorry, I don't think it's Romans. I think it's maybe Titus. Anyway, wherever it is, it says that we are to help all people, but to have especially the household of faith. That there's something closer about those who are spiritually together than even family ties can have. That just as that is true, here he's saying that he says, esteem such men as Epaphroditus, esteem people like Epaphroditus, that those who value deeply, those who are willing to sacrifice like Christ did, who are willing to sacrifice everything, and just to comfort one another, just to make each other feel better, much less to overcome conflict. And we're talking about the big picture of Philippians as conflict. And he says, if Epaphroditus is willing to sacrifice so much just to comfort you, what wouldn't we give up when it comes to conflict? What didn't Christ give up to end the conflict between us and bring him closer to him, to bring us closer to him? That if we're willing to give up so much just for basic comfort, conflict should just be a given when there's conflict, unless it's about doctrinal truths that God holds. When it's just matters of opinion, we are willing to readily give those up. And we would be that way if we were so ready to sacrifice so much just to help each other feel better when we're grieving. And so he's, again, pointing back to Philippians chapter 2 and verses 1 through 4. And he says, in particular, he says that to hold such men in esteem, and continues, because for the work of Christ they came close to death. Now there, when it says close, the word that's used for close is the idea to throttle somebody's neck. That's the original use of it, to squeeze someone. How close are you to someone if you're throttling their neck? Hopefully nobody knows from any experience. Just keep that to yourself if that's the case. But how close are to you? If you're just right there. How close were they to death? He keeps emphasizing this. It's as if death was right there holding them by the neck. And so, how much risk are they taking? How close did he get to death so that he could do the work of Christ and go to Paul? How much risk are they taking? How much risk did James take in Acts chapter 12 when Herod, decapitated him because he was a Christian? That's a very literal example of how much he was willing to give up for the cause of Christ. And that's, it's not always just about preaching. Sometimes it's just about helping one another, which is the case here with Epaphroditus. How much are they willing to risk? I think this takes us back to the soldier thing that he talked about. He said, we're fellow soldiers. We have a cause that's greater than each one of us. And so we're willing to take great risk for God and for one another because of how much God loves us and because of how much we love one another. He says, not regarding his life, so that he knew there was a risk of getting sick and going to Paul, is really what he's saying. He knew that this was a likely thing. And it's a sickness that killed a lot of people. It just wasted them away, whatever it was. But he took that risk to supply what was lacking in your service toward me. The Philippians wanted to meet Paul's needs, and Paul wanted to meet their needs. And by putting each other first, after making sure that they had their own basic needs met by putting each other first, and knowing the health risk, they were able to live out what Philippians 2, 1 through 4 describes. And so you think this is Epaphroditus. He is supplying his need. He's not regarding his life. And the language that's used there implies this idea of to minister to him. The word for minister implies the idea that you fulfill a service out of an obligation, out of a role that you hold. The church gave him the role of going to Paul with a message and to deliver it. And because he had that role, because the church gave it to him, he took it very seriously. And so he submitted to that role. Well, isn't that just what Christ did back in Philippians chapter 2 and verses 5 through 8? Talks about how he submitted to the role that he chose to play, that cost him something great. And so you see these echoes of these same ideas over and over again, that he submitted to this role because he trusted the church and he loved the church. And so when the church said, we want you to do this, just like Christ was willing to submit, to empty himself, to become both God and human, He was willing to submit by emptying his life with the sickness, that risk, just to bring Paul a little bit of help, whatever it is that he needed. And so he submitted to this role, and then he was obedient to what the church gave him to do. The church gave him a job, and he did it. And that's what Paul described in Philippians 2:12 through 18. The emphasis there was on obedience, because we trust God and we love one another. And so when the church said, do this, he knew the risk, but he said, I will obey anyway, because this is what Christ did. This is what Paul does. This is the example that we're given. And I'm happy to do it because I care about Paul and I care about the people in Philippi. And so he says to value people like this, that we hold in the highest regard. He says esteem, we hold in the highest opinion those people who are like this. And I think he says that because, remember, there's this conflict. And there's the Jewish Christians who want them to follow the law of Moses. That's what chapter 3 is fixing to start talking about. And there's the Gentile Christians who are rightfully saying that's not what we're supposed to do. And they're starting to create into these cliques and these divisions. And it's not based on quality of character. It's based on, matters of opinion. I think you should do this. I think you should do that, instead of listening to God's word. And he's saying, don't form your closest associations based on the people who agree with your opinions, because that's often what happens in the church. I want to hire this preacher, or I want to do this Bible class material. And of course, I'm not saying it happens here, but just generally that's what happens in the church. And he says, well, sometimes we form our closest associations with people who think like we do about matters of opinion. He says, don't esteem that. That's not what gives us unity. That's not what brings God glory. He says, esteem the people who share deeply in the gospel work, who crave deeply to comfort God's people, who grieve deeply for God's people, that shows their deep love for them, who look deeply into worthy thoughts, who are trying to think like Paul tells us to in a mature way, and who value deeply those who are willing to sacrifice like Christ. That when those are the things that matter most to us, unity becomes a lot simpler and easier, because we're thinking in a mature mindset like Christ does, and therefore we have the joy that Christ had. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, he says, for the joy that was set before him. What was the joy that was set before Christ? The cross. The joy that was set before him. He did not want to go to the cross. You read about, as Johnny mentioned in the garden, he did not want to go to the cross. But he said, not my will, but yours, because he knew on the other side of the cross was true joy that he could bring to the world if only we would just listen and accept what the truth that he is teaching us. And so it says, looking to that joy is only seen during difficulty. If I can get through this conflict, look to that joy on the other side of it. It's only seen when we can think maturely. We only think maturely when we are applying these principles that Paul is giving us through the commands of chapter 2, 1 through 4, and the 4 examples that follow. All right, any other thoughts about Epaphroditus or anything we've looked at this morning? After this, starting, I think, next week, we don't have a guest speaker. No, so next week we'll be starting in chapter 3, and so he's going to move into sort of a new section of Philippians, where he's going to be focusing just a little bit more on kind of the practical side of things, but it's all going to be building on the information that we've looked at so far. Is still talking about conflict and the mindset that helps us to overcome conflict as a congregation. And so we'll be looking at that next week. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your comments, and hopefully you can enjoy your afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you this evening.